You are standing in Asakusa, Tokyo, in front of Sensoji. Incense smoke drifts across the courtyard in front of the main hall. Behind you, the shopping street is loud with shutters and voices, and the crowd moves the way it moves every single day of the year. Vendors call out the names of rice crackers and sweet buns. Visitors line up to angle their phones at the 5-story pagoda without knowing its name. This is one of the most visited temples in the city, and at its very center sits a statue that no one is allowed to look at. Not the abbot, not the monks, not anyone. That has been true for 1400 years. Why would the one thing at the heart of a place this crowded be the one thing nobody ever sees? The story begins before dawn, in the year 628. The sky over the water was still dark. A single boat on the Sumida River. 2 fishermen brothers, Hinokuma Hamanari and Hinokuma Takanari, cast their net the way they did every morning. Nothing came up. They hauled it in and threw it again, and not one fish came with it. What came up instead was a small golden figure tangled in the wet cords. They threw it back into the river. The same figure returned in the net. The brothers carried word of it to the head of their village, Hajino Nakatomo. He took the statue in his own hands, turned his own home into a hall, and enshrined it there. That is said to be the beginning of Sensoji, a great temple that started as one room in one villager's house. But the moment when this statue vanished from human sight altogether would not come for another 20 years. But when it did, it would never be undone. The statue enshrined in Nakatomo's house drew worshippers. Year after year, more of them came, until what had begun as one family's private devotion was no longer private at all. Then, in 645, the first year of the Taika era, the priest Shokai Shonen declared it an absolute hibutsu, a hidden Buddha that would never be shown to anyone, ever. According to Sensoji's own account, Kannon appeared to Shokai in a dream one night and told him plainly not to gaze upon the image. Whether that dream happened, no one can prove. What can be proven is what followed. From that night forward, the temple treated the instruction as absolute law. Even its own head priests, generation after generation, have kept themselves from looking. The men who held the keys were the men who refused to turn them. But worshippers still wanted the feeling of having seen something. Faith sits easier when there is a shape in front of you. So in 857, the great Tendai monk En-nin secluded himself at the temple and carved a substitute with his own hands, a stand-in modeled on the hidden statue, the Omaedachi Honzon. Everything people have knelt before since then, every coin tossed into the box and every prayer spoken in that hall has been offered to that copy. The vow came close to breaking exactly once. In 1897, the 30th year of Meiji, a faction of Shinto scholars began arguing that the statue inside was not canon at all, but a deity named Sukuna Hikona no Mikoto. It was not a small question. What sat inside that cabinet decided what the temple itself was. An official from the Jingi Khan, the government body that oversaw Shinto affairs, ordered the head priest to open the zushi, the lacquered shrine cabinet that had stayed shut for centuries. Inside was a wrapped bundle. When they opened the wrapping, the cloth crumbled apart in their hands, and underneath it, the head priest testified afterward, was a statue in the unmistakable form of Kannon. More than 1,000 years of silence, broken once, never since. But prayer and silence are not the only forces that shape this place. The buildings themselves, the gates, the halls, the pagoda, were raised and raised again by the most powerful men of the age of the samurai. According to the temple's own records, in the year 940, Taira no Masakado rose in rebellion in eastern Japan, and Sensoji was left in ruins by the fighting that swept across the region. On the side that put the rebellion down was Masakado's own cousin, Taira no Kinmasa. When the war ended, Kinmasa was appointed governor of Musashi, the province that contained Asakusa itself, as reward for his service. In thanks for the post, he rebuilt the wrecked temple and donated 2 gates, the Kaminarimon, the Thunder Gate, and the Neomon, named for the guardian kings who stand inside it. A wound opened by one branch of a family was closed by another man from the same family. Roughly 240 years later, in 1180, Minamoto no Yoritomo raised an army in Izu. He lost at the Battle of Ishibashiyama, gathered the warrior clans of the east anyway, and rode into Kamakura. On the very day he arrived, before setting up a government, before anything else, he went to worship at a shrine to the war god Hachiman. 5 days later, he moved that shrine to the site where Tsurugaoka Hachimangu stands today. One tradition holds that temple carpenters were summoned from Asakusa in Musashi province to carry out the work. Whether that is true is uncertain. If it is, then the craftsmen who had been building Sensoji since Taira no Kinmasa's day were also standing on the ground where the Kamakura shogunate was born. Why did Yoritomo put a shrine ahead of everything else on his first day? The answer was more than a century old. His ancestor Minamoto no Yoriyoshi had prayed to Hachiman for victory during the Zenkunen War in the northeast. In 1064, returning to the capital in triumph, Yoriyoshi made good on that vow by enshrining Hachiman beside the family residence. That was the beginning of the Minamoto clan god. His son Yoshiie came of age as a boy at Iwashimizu Hachimangu and took the name Hachiman Taro, Hachiman's eldest son. From then on, Hachiman was not simply an object of faith for the Minamoto. He was the god who guaranteed victory itself, carried into every campaign the family fought. For Yoritomo, rebuilding Tsurugaoka Hachimangu was the act of transplanting 100 years of inherited legitimacy into a brand new samurai capital. Heian was ending. Kamakura was beginning. And in the middle of that upheaval, quietly, without ever being the center of anything, Sensoji grew more important. Kamakura fell too eventually. Through Muromachi and the long wars of the Sengoku age, the temple waited. Then it was bound to one more warlord, a man with his eye on the whole country. That man was Tokugawa Ieyasu. He arrived in this region in 1590, sent there on Toyotomi Hideyoshi's orders. Almost immediately, he designated Sensoji the official prayer temple of his domain and granted it 500 koku of land. One koku was reckoned as the rice needed to feed a person for a year, which makes 500 a working estate with real income behind it, not a polite gesture from a new lord. It meant the temple could keep its priests, maintain its buildings, and remain independent of whichever merchant or local lord happened to be nearby. Faith was not the whole reason. Asakusa held a port on the Sumida River, a crossroads where boats unloaded and goods piled up. It was also a military position facing north, toward old rival powers like the Date clan. In territory he had only just taken, seizing control of a temple that already commanded the devotion of the local people was a way of tightening his grip on the land itself. Patronage did not make the temple fireproof. In 1631, the 8th year of Kanye, the halls of Sensoji burned to the ground. Iemitsu sponsored a new main hall in 1635, and only 7 years after that, in 1642, a fire that started in a merchant's shop in the town outside the gate spread through the grounds and burned it down again. Wood, paper, and packed streets. The town that made the temple rich was the same town that kept setting it alight. That second fire also destroyed the Toshogu shrine on the temple grounds, dedicated to Ieyasu himself. It was never rebuilt. A shogun's own name, burned out of the compound he had once protected, and never spoken there again. Iemitsu still did not abandon the place. A 5-story pagoda went up in 1648, the first year of Keian. The main hall followed in 1649, 7 full years of reconstruction from the ashes. No record survives of how much it cost, or how many carpenters and laborers it took. What is known is what happened afterward. That main hall stood, unburned, for roughly 300 years. Not every building on the grounds was so lucky. In 1865, the first year of Keio, a fire broke out in Tawaramachi and consumed the Kaminarimon. The gate that burned had stood at the entrance to Asakusa for more than 200 years, since Iemitsu's time. Generations of people had walked under it without ever imagining the street without it. This was the kind of landmark people used without noticing, a place to say, "Meet me there," and be understood. This time, it was not rebuilt. The Tokugawa shogunate collapsed soon after, and the Meiji era arrived. Under the new government's policy of separating Shinto from Buddhism, temples across the country watched their financial foundations shake apart, and nobody came forward with the money for a gate that size. Then came the Kanto Earthquake, then the war. The disasters this temple had to survive simply kept coming, one before the last one had been paid for. It was never a single reason. It was one collapse stacked on the next. By the time the Kaminarimon stood again, 95 years had passed. 3 generations of Asakusa residents were born, grew old, and died having never once seen it standing. The site was not entirely bare. In 1906, during celebrations for the victory in the Russo-Japanese War, a temporary triumphal arch was put up where the gate had been. But it was temporary, and it came down. No permanent gate replaced it. The enormous red lantern that every visitor photographs today, the Great Gate itself, through the end of Edo, through Meiji, through Taisho, into the early Showa years, none of it was actually there. The most famous image of Asakusa was an empty space. And during that 95-year gap, Sensoji faced 2 more disasters far worse than any fire before them. The first arrived at 11:58 in the morning on September 1st, 1923, the 12th year of Taisho, magnitude 7.9, the Great Kanto Earthquake. It struck at the hour when most households were cooking lunch over open flame. The shaking was not what killed the city. The fires that followed were, thousands of them starting at once in kitchens across a city built of wood. More than 100,000 people died across Tokyo, and roughly 40,000 of them died in a single place, a corner of Honjo where crowds had fled carrying what they owned, and a firestorm swallowed them whole. 96% of Asakusa Ward burned. The Ryo Unkaku, the 52-meter tower that had been the beloved symbol of Asakusa Park and the tallest thing anyone in the neighborhood had ever climbed, lost its upper floors in the quake and was demolished without ever being used again. Inside that devastation, the refugees who had fled onto the temple grounds were organized by one man. He was a local Toby foreman, a master of the traditional scaffolding trade, the men who worked the high beams and knew fire the way sailors know weather. His name was never written down. He put the crowd into a bucket brigade, line by line, hand to hand, and they held the advancing fire back at the edges of Sensoji. Nearly the entire neighborhood burned. Ash fell for hours afterward, settling over a district that no longer had streets to settle on. The main hall built in Iemitsu's time somehow did not. The temple survived the first disaster. 22 years would pass before it faced anything worse. The second one would be unlike anything before it. It came just after midnight on March 10, 1945. 325 B-29 bombers appeared over Tokyo and across 2.5 hours dropped roughly 1,665 tons of incendiaries. Asakusa had been marked as a top priority target precisely because so many people were packed into so little space. A strong northwest wind took the flames and drove them through the narrow streets faster than anyone could run. In that single night, more than an estimated 100,000 people across Tokyo were killed, one of the deadliest single air raids in the history of the world. The main hall that had come through the earthquake did not come through this. The main hall, the 5-story pagoda, the Neomon. Not from direct hits, but from fire moving building to building. Everything central to Sensoji was gone by morning. The temple that had taken 7 years to rebuild after the 17th century fire vanished before that night's sun came up. 300 years of standing ended in a few hours. The statue at the heart of it was not in that fire. Before the raids intensified, the priests had been quietly preparing for exactly this. They buried the statue 3 meters underground, directly beneath the cannon hall. It was sealed inside a bronze water basin, lowered into the pit, and covered over with earth. While the hall above burned through the night, The hidden Buddha sat in silence directly below the flames, untouched by them. Everything above ground was reduced to ash and framework by morning. 3 meters down, nothing had changed at all. The main hall was rebuilt in 1958. The 5-story pagoda followed in 1973. But the vow had already been kept, long before either of them went up. 1,400 years of never showing it to anyone survived even this, by being taken out of the world entirely and put into the ground. Meanwhile, the gate that had disappeared 95 years earlier was still missing. The Kaminarimon had been gone for almost a century. The man who finally brought it back was not a samurai, not a priest, not a politician. He was a businessman. Around 1955, Matsushita Konosuke, founder of Matsushita Electric, the company known today as Panasonic, was suffering from nerve pain no doctor could explain. It grew bad enough that he could barely stand or walk, and Western medicine did nothing for it. On a friend's suggestion, he asked Shimizudani Kyojun, the abbot of Sensoji, to perform a prayer ritual for him. His symptoms, strangely, began to improve. As thanks, Konosuke donated a television set, a modest gift, and at the time a rare and expensive one. That donation opened a door. In December 1958, Abbot Shimizudani visited Matsushita Electric's Tokyo branch office and raised the subject of the Kaminarimon, the gate that had not been rebuilt since the fire at the end of the Edo period. He explained what it would cost to raise it again. It was a large sum. Konosuke is said to have thought about it for roughly 10 seconds before agreeing to fund the entire thing. He attached one condition. He would pay for it, but he wanted his name kept out of it as much as possible. Construction began in May 1959, this time in reinforced concrete rather than the wood that had burned so often before. On May 3, 1960, after 95 years of empty ground, the Kaminarimon stood again. The great lantern hanging in it measures 3.9 meters tall and 3.3 meters wide, and weighs about 700 kilograms, heavier than a car, hanging over the heads of the crowd. Its frame is built from bamboo grown in Kamioka, near Kyoto, and its surface is roughly 300 sheets of washi paper from Fukui, layered and pasted together by hand. The one condition was the one thing he did not get. Abbot Shimizudani told the story of the donation everywhere he went, and word spread fast. Look up at that lantern today, and the name written on it is not Matsushita Electric. It reads Matsushita Konosuke. The lantern is stripped and repapered every 10 years by craftsmen in Kyoto, and Panasonic still pays for it, decade after decade. Sensoji has burned, collapsed, been buried, and come back. One thing never changed. The statue enshrined deep inside this temple is still there, and still, no one sees it. Anyone who visits Sensoji today walks under that great lantern at the Kaminarimon. It is the lantern left behind in 1960 by a man who asked to stay anonymous, Matsushita Konosuke, and Panasonic still covers the cost of it. Once a decade, craftsmen in Kyoto take it apart, strip the paper, and skin it new. Past the lantern, at the center of the main hall, is the small statue pulled from the Sumida River 1,400 years ago. It is still there, a few meters from the crowd, behind doors that stay shut. The brothers who hauled the net, Hinokuma Hamanari and Hinokuma Takanari, Shokai Shonin, who ruled that it must never be seen, Ennin, who carved the stand-in with his own hands, the nameless Toby foreman who stopped the fire with a line of buckets, the priests who put the statue 3 meters into the ground to keep it from the bombs, and Matsushita Konosuke, who filled in the missing gate and asked for no credit. Not one of them lived in the same era as another. None of them ever met. Each took a turn protecting the same single object, then handed it forward. None of them set out to build a legend. Each one simply did the one thing asked of him, and the temple did the rest. Once a year, on December 13th at 2 in the afternoon, the doors of the main hall open. The day is called Otogibi. What is revealed is the Omayadachi Hanzon, the substitute Ennin carved in 857. The real one stays exactly where it is, seen by no one. Tomorrow, tens of thousands of people will pass through the Kaminarimon again, walk the Nakamais, and press their hands together in front of the main hall. Most of them will take photographs, drop a coin, pray before the stand-in, and go home satisfied. Not one of them will see the real thing, and almost none of them will know that. The gate they walk through, the lantern they photograph, the hall they bow to, every visible piece of this temple has been rebuilt, replaced, or repainted within living memory. For 1,400 years, this temple has burned, collapsed, been buried, and returned. The buildings were the part that kept changing. Gates, halls, a pagoda, raised and lost and raised again. The part that never changed was a single promise, that what sits at the center will not be shown. Is what matters most protected by being seen? Or are there things that can only be kept by hiding them, year after year, forever? Japan is full of stories still being guarded quietly like this one, in places people walk past every day. Where the next secret leads, subscribe and follow it with me.